to take a look at, moving on in this chapter 9, we're taking a look at section 3, looking a little bit about children with disabilities. Now, the reason we talk about children with disabilities in this section is this is where often disabilities, particularly learning disabilities, begin to be identified in those middle childhood years when children start entering school. Remember, we're talking about ages 6 to 12. Now, one of the disabilities that are often diagnosed during this time is ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. And the definition in your book is a disorder characterized by excessive inattention, impulsiveness, and hyperactivity. Hyperactivity can be things like excessive restlessness, and overactivity. So the degree of hyperactivity here is crucial because normal children are active and overactive and fidgety from time to time. It's that degree of hyperactivity that we're really kind of looking at. When we're looking at ADHD, we're typically looking at it showing or revealing itself by about age 7. Many times it's very hard for ADHD kids to function in a school setting, typically the kinds of school settings that are common in the United States, where sitting in a desk all day paying attention is just a recipe for disaster for these kids. Now, typically about 1 to 5% of U.S. children, school-age children, are identified as ADHD. Now, we know that ADHD is sometimes overdiagnosed. Children who misbehave in school are sometimes diagnosed with ADHD to encourage more acceptable behavior. So really behavior they can actually have some control over versus, ADHD that is occurring because of an actual problem, or an attention because of an actual problem. Okay, moving on. If we look at causes of ADHD and some treatment and outcome of those treatments, there does seem to be a genetic component with ADHD involving the brain chemical dopamine. Studies, if we look at the brains of kids with ADHD and without, there does seem to be a difference in the brain chemistry, the makeup of that brain. Could also be factors in terms of brain function, executive control, and control of the brain over motor skills and more primitive functions, leading to that hyperactivity and overactivity. Now, stimulants are actually effective with ADHD because basically they stimulate the brain. They give the brain something to work on. They stimulate dopamine and noradrenaline. It stimulates that executive center of the brain and allows more control of the primitive areas of the brain. So stimulants like Ritalin are pretty widespread. It's found that stimulants actually do increase children's attention span and improve academic performance. Most children with ADHD, however, do continue to have problems in school with attention and conduct or learning later on in adolescence and adulthood. Other learning disabilities that we want to take a look at that are typically diagnosed during this time, one of them is dyslexia. Many children who are intelligent and come from even a home life where there's academic enrichment do seem to have problems reading or doing simple math problems. Usually this is diagnosed when children who should be performing at a certain level or an expected level for their age and for their intelligence aren't performing at level, and there's nothing else really going on with them. There's no vision and hearing, there's no developmental disability, and there's no socioeconomic disadvantage. And the younger that we can catch this with children, the better chance we have of helping them learn strategies to compensate for these kinds of learning disabilities. Now, dyslexia can be an issue because of sensory and neurological problems, and this can contribute to difficulties in reading. This could be, seems to be potentially genetic, where looking at problems in the left hemisphere of the brain, we know this is where language skills develop. And so in this hemisphere, there are there's structure called the angular gyrus. And the angular gyrus basically translates visual information. So things we see like on the page here, like we're looking at here, where it says the owl was a bird. And it transforms it into auditory information. It could be difficult then, if we have problems with that angular gyrus, make it difficult for the person who's reading to associate letters with particular sounds. And so when we say sound out a word in order to read it, that's going to be super difficult for someone with dyslexia that's resulting from an angular gyrus problem. Like I said before, it could also be a problem with circulation in the left hemisphere of the brain, which could result in oxygen deficiency. And we know, again, that language lives in that left hemisphere. There does seem to be a genetic component that 25 to 65% of children who are dyslexic also have one dyslexic parent. About 40% of the children, 40% of children with dyslexia, I can't talk today, also have siblings who are dyslexic. And if we look at the picture, this is a picture also in your book to the right of the content here. Dyslexic children sometimes have a hard time discriminating sounds as accurately as other kids do. So for instance, B's, D's, and P's can be hard to tell apart. And so we see here an example of that, B's, D's, and P's. And so that can also confuse reading ability. And dyslexia also leads to a mix-up of the letters, a rotation of letters, or reversals is shown here. So it can be very difficult for the dyslexic to learn to write and to read. Now, so these kids with dyslexia and other kids with disabilities typically focus on what's called remediation, giving them skills to kind of give a workaround for the issues, whatever issues they're having. They're given exercises to help them. For dyslexic folks, children become aware of how to blend sounds to form words. Other kinds of behavioral approaches can be used for kids with ADHD, giving them things to do, helping them understand what triggers them, helping them to understand what kinds of alternate activities might be appropriate for them if they're feeling overstimulated or overactive. Now, one thing that's happened recently, probably in the last 25 years, is the idea of mainstreaming. It used to be that children with disabilities were segregated from other children in the classroom. They had their own classrooms, separate classes. They weren't integrated with kids without disabilities. And an approach that's much more common now, which is called mainstreaming, is that all kids are together in a regular classroom, and kids that have disabilities have adaptations for whatever needs they might have. So they're in the regular classroom. They're not segregated out. There's not that stigma around the learning disability. And even now, research shows that most children with at least mild learning disabilities do spend most of the school day in regular classrooms. So it may be still for children with significant disabilities, moderate to severe disabilities, they may still find themselves in their own classroom. But at least for kids with mild learning disabilities, they're quite often in with the rest of their peers.